Howdy, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford. In this video I want to talk about one of the most frequent and persistent questions about pronunciation that I get in regards to Old Norse, which is whether the letter V in Old Norse really represents a V sound or represents a W sound. This is kind of an ironic question given that most people have settled on pronouncing Old Norse just like modern Icelandic. And if you do that, it's simple, it's a V. But at the same time, there has crept into the popular discourse about Old Norse that the V is actually a W. And so you find people who pronounce Old Norse more or less like modern Icelandic but pronounce the V's as W's, which isn't Icelandic and it isn't Old Norse either. The issue is that the sound represented by V in Old Norse was originally a W sound, but that in the modern Scandinavian languages, with some interesting exceptions, it's a V. So the W sound became a V sound. The big question is, when? I'm going to look at that in this video. Alright, so you might notice that where Old Norse has a V, the cognate English word, the English word that comes from the same root, and these are very closely related languages, has a W. So Old Norse vis corresponds to English wise. Old Norse veðr corresponds to English weather. Now, an exception to this is when you have an English word where a W precedes an O or a U, because then the Old Norse word has no V or W at all. So for example, the Old Norse god's name Odin is equivalent to Old English Woden, and then there's a regional variation in England, Wedin, which is where we get Wednesday. And then in a similar way, Old Norse Orð is equivalent to English word, Old Norse Ulfr, equivalent to English wolf, Old Norse Ormur to English worm. So it's a regular thing. So at some point, from runic inscriptions, it appears that it's probably in the 600s or so that W disappeared before O's and U's, but it remained in Old Norse before other vowels. So in borrowings into English from Old Norse during the Viking Age, we see a W sound there. So for example, the word that in standard classical Old Norse or Old Icelandic in the 1200s is vondr, meaning wand, is borrowed into Old English as wand. And presumably, in the Old Danish of the Viking raiders in eastern England in the 800s, that word was in fact wandur, which is ancestral to the later form vondr that we get in classical Old Norse. So you have to remember that what we talk about as Old Norse is typically, again, Old Icelandic in the 1200s. There is earlier Old Norse, including the Old Norse of the Viking Age. So now, the fact that words that have V in classical Old Norse are borrowed into English with W's does not necessarily mean, however, that it wasn't already a V in that Viking Age Old Norse. The reason is that Old English actually doesn't have any initial V's. The sound of V in Old English is only present in the middle of words. So W might still have just been the closest equivalent sound they could find if that Old Norse sound had already become a V. Now let's take a moment, after I give you a quick word from my sponsor that I'll insert here, to talk about what the situation is in modern Scandinavia and what means I use to estimate about when the W to V change happened and how it might be different in different parts of Scandinavia. So again, if you look at standard Icelandic, standard Swedish, standard Danish, or either of the two standard varieties of Norwegian, the letter V represents a sound V. That is, impressionistically at least, close to English V. It isn't always exactly the same sound in a technical phonetic sense. Sometimes it's an approximate rather than the fricative that's used in English, but it sounds like a V to English speakers and is interpreted as the same sound as a V by Scandinavians who know English in a Scandinavian language, which is basically all of them. There are dialects, however, which even in recent times had a W sound there instead. So I've heard recordings of speakers born in the 1860s and 90s in Västerbotten, Sweden, who said wait and war, not vet and var. Or born in the 1870s in Norrbotten, who say we, not vi. And then the Elfdalian language, which is spoken in Dalarna in Sweden, very archaic form of East Scandinavian, technically not even really a dialect of Swedish in as much as it's had some of its own distinct changes and participates in basically none of the distinct changes of Swedish. It sort of famously continues the W sound from Proto-Norse. So if we look at classical Old Icelandic that we'll call Old Norse in the 1200s, we get var, vorum, ver, vet, var. And in Elfdalian, that's still a W. Var, varum, wir, vet, wa. Or in Swedish, of course, those are all V's. So there are still, and then also in there's weird situations like in parts of northern Jutland and Denmark, where you actually have all W's. So even the old V sounds, which are represented by F in Old Norse, are pronounced W. So you get like Hueska for Viskad and Uplovels for Uplevelsa. I'm not great at pronouncing standard Danish because I'm too Norwegian in my pronunciation. So clearly there's some peripheral dialects. So for example, in northern Jutland, possibly if that's what's going on, it could actually be that, you know, all the V's turn back into the W's later in northern Jutland. But certainly in places like Elfdalian or in parts of Norrbotten, Västerbotten, where the W has hung on from Proto-Norse all the way to the present, skipping that W to V change. But the standard languages must have had this change at some point, and I think that happened later in the Eastern Scandinavian languages than it did in the Western Scandinavian languages. In the Western Scandinavian languages, we already have rhymes in skaldic poetry, which is a very complicated kind of poetry in Old Norse that includes a lot of very difficult rhymes. We already have rhymes where the old V sound written with an F rhymes with the V sound written V, which comes from an original W. An example of that, in the late 900s, an Icelandic poet named Thorbjorn Dísaskald composed a line, Svivor numin lífi, or Sviv, rhymes with leave. Now that second V in Svivor comes from an old W. It's cognate with the English word wary. And then that F, which is pronounced as a V in Old Norse, is cognate with English life. So clearly the V from F and the V from W have fallen together in the pretty early Icelandic in the late 900s of Thorbjorn Dísaskald. And in a lot of manuscripts from Norway and Sweden, we find confusion between F and V between vowels, suggesting that at least between vowels, these sounds had fallen together in classical Old Norse. So for example, in Volspan Skama 42 on page 3R of the Flatøyarbók manuscript in Iceland from about 1390, we see Thadan koma snjóvar with what's originally a W or V spelled F, as they don't know the difference between the sounds anymore, so they don't know why they spell one way and one the other way. Now, I think this is happening later in Swedish, but I think it's probably happened by the 1526 Old Swedish translation of the Bible. If we look there, we see spellings from old F's, havet, avond, bliva, or havet, avond, which are from old F's, being spelled the same way as spellings that are from either borrowings from Northern German, where there's a B, or from Old Norse WVs, so helvita, bliva. That implies to me these are all the same sound by that time. Now that change from a W to a V is actually a really, really common sound in the world's languages. It's happened in German, for example, and in Dutch, two other languages that are very close to English, to where you see, for example, the word water in English still has the W, but spelled the same way in Dutch, that's water, and in German, of course, Wasser, with another sound shift, consonant shift. And of course, this happened in Latin. Fairly famously, classical Latin actually pronounced those V's as W's. But, of course, in the modern Romance languages, those V's have all become V's. So that, for example, Latin ventus, wind, the classical pronunciation, is French vent, in Spanish, viento. Or servire, to serve, is French, servir, and Spanish, servir. And I know I'm not a Romance scholar. I'm sure my accent offends people one way or another. But I'll point out something interesting about that change in Latin. When that V letter follows another consonant, it actually retains its W pronunciation and is spelled U today. So for example, the number 4, quatuor in Latin, French quatre, which of course the W is later lost in French there, but Spanish cuatro, or Latin suavis becoming Spanish suave, where that first V in Latin has retained that W pronunciation because it follows another consonant, but the one that's between vowels becomes a V. I actually wonder if something like that was true in Old Norse too. One reason I think this is based on some Icelandic pronunciations I've heard over the years. There's a fair number of Icelanders who pronounce the word so, which is spelled SVO in modern Icelandic, SV long A in Old Norse, as something that for all the world sounds to my ears like svo. But even more markedly, in Eastern Iceland, I've heard older people, and I'm not just talking about old people, I'm talking about people who are older than me, but not old, who say, for example, what instead of kvad for what. So, at least in parts of Iceland, certainly in Eastern Iceland, some of those old V's remain W sounds after consonants, which would be exactly parallel to the Latin to Romance language situation. And I wonder if something like that might not be true of Old Norse as well, because again, the rhymes only really give us evidence that between vowels, the change of W to V happened pretty early. But it's very difficult to document that necessarily happened after consonants very early too. And without the evidence of, say, outsiders who could have observed these languages for us and written down these changes as they happened, which is a pipe dream. You need a time machine to get somebody interested in that to go back and do that. We're never going to know for sure. But I tend to think that Thorbjorn Dísarskáld and the confusion of V and F in manuscripts testifies that in West Norse, W became V between vowels in the 900s. Probably elsewhere, maybe not after consonants. And that in East Norse, it had probably happened by 1500 or so, based on the Swedish translation of the Bible from 1526, although it didn't happen in all dialects of Swedish, and it didn't happen in Elfdalian. Whether you can ever make an exact time scale for that, I don't know, but it means that in my reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation that I use on this channel and elsewhere, which is based on 1200s or so Icelandic or Norwegian, I'm going to pronounce those W's as V's. Sometimes I kind of experiment with pronouncing them as W's after consonants, like saying what instead of fat. In fact, I do that pretty often. But as with anything, it's a little bit hard to say because that phoneme just had such a one-for-one replacement, right? In modern Icelandic, in Reykjavik, V's mean V. So we don't really have a way of knowing when that change happened, only that it did. All right, I'll stop yapping at you. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the very best.